Thank you. It's very nice to be here with all of you today. And I asked for this kind of change only because it seems to me that now that we've had just about a year of Pope Francis, my job as director of the Hank Center, I've been going around having to give little talks and even big talks about Francis. I think it's more about the fact that I run a center than it is about me. Because if you know, you can go onto the web and you can every single day get something new about Pope Francis. I mean, he's on Huffington Post. You just name it, you can find him. Everyone's intrigued by this man. And so I thought to myself, well, this is really a derivative kind of talk, but maybe the way that I put it together might give some of us some good ideas and thoughts for reflection. So Pope Francis, the New World Pope, as you see. Of course, he was also on Time Magazine as the Man of the Year. But right after he was named, this is March of 2013, he's called the New World Pope, and it has been a kind of new pope and a new world with this pope, at least in terms of how the Catholic Church engages not only the community of Roman Catholics but the world. What I want to do is I want to break this up into three different parts. I want to talk about Pope Francis's context as a Latin American and as a Jesuit. That's the first thing. I want to look at some of his style, some of the style as substance as the centerpiece. And then I want to kind of conclude with some of the things that I see going on just from what I read and from who I talk to. A kind of not so much a man of revolution, but a man of reformation. And I use that word purposefully. So those will be those three parts for this. Well, Pope Francis's context. I think I still have... Besides just in America, here are just some other ones. You can go and Google front magazines, and there are about 12. I just picked 3. But you see him, the most interesting man in the world. I mean, it's funny that this kind of that postmodernity and those who kind of run on the media in postmodernity, they're all very, very excited. And if I'm correct, some of these these magazines are actually kind of more like People magazines for many different countries too. So we have that as well. But his context then, let's maybe start there. Pope Francis's context is Latin American, right? He has been part of a church that has really weathered the geopolitical and evangelical storms of the Southern Hemisphere for the 20th century, right? And in that regard, in some ways, it's a different kind of experience of context of church, as opposed to what we might call a European context where John Paul II and Benedict came out of. And the first thing we should say is that part of that context is that Catholicism had a different engagement with culture. It wasn't so much about secular culture, but it was about a culture already embedded within a Catholic culture. And what part of that is liberation theology, a term you might have heard of, right? And in liberation theology, in at least Argentina, came out of this kind of dirty war, was kind of built around or a response to the dirty war of the dictatorships in Argentina. Bergoglio comes to assume leadership as a Jesuit, but he's very much part and parcel of the up and down economic world, the poverty of Argentina. Bergoglio, in some of his statements, especially since he's been made Pope, gives this idea that in some ways liberation theology, a preferential option for the poor, is kind of just in the air we breathe. It's not something we have to kind of figure out or make an assent to or make a claim that, yes, we should do this. It just kind of grows up in his experience, both as a Jesuit, as a priest, as an Argentinian. And in that way, in some ways, liberation theology is post-ideological for him. If you might know, in the 80s and 90s, liberation theology was very much kind of, is it too Marxist? Is it too much kind of against the discourses of Roman Catholicism? Can they ever match up? And I really think that for Bergoglio, I'm going to call him that at this point, it's not. It's very much part of the air that he breathes. And so you have, of course, him living through the mothers looking for their children, these kinds of protests. He very much has that. He also has what I would call an urban sensibility, a sensibility of the urban poverty, but also the urban centers of South America. He was a pastor of the cities, of the urban poor, of schools and hospitals for the poor. There's a large community of schools called Fe Alegria, which in some ways is kind of like Jesuit schools, but are really focused on the poor in a different way than some, say, of our prep schools, like St. Ignatius here or Loyola Academy are. More kind of like closer to what we have, if you know, the Cristo Rey schools, a kind of a school that really is trying to work with a different community. So that whole idea of the preferential option for the poor comes out there. He was very much a man who's very simple in his lifestyle, partly perhaps of his own Jesuit training, which we'll get to in a second, but also possibly just because because again, this is a world of a very small group of haves and a very large group of have-nots in urban dwellings. We don't know that very well, except maybe the inner city kind of experience, but imagine that kind of threefold, fourfold. I also think that, these are just pictures of him in his simplicity. Here's him on the subway. He took the subway every day, as you might have recalled when he was first elected. That was a big news article. Pope takes, the Cardinal Archbishop takes the subway, takes his own transportation, doesn't have a driver. One of the other contexts of Latin America is the rise of Pentecostalism. It's a continent then that is not really becoming ideologically secular as much as it is one that's kind of a Catholic crisis among cousins of Christianity. And so it has a very different feel than kind of saying, how can Roman Catholicism speak to the secular state? How can Roman Catholicism speak to a secular media? Although secularism is also part of the air of Argentina or South America, it's a very different kind of tension. It's not so much the tension of us against them, but really of trying to figure out what's this Pentecostalism, how does it fit into a kind of a Catholic world? And so I would say that in some ways it's more about breaking down that transnational Catholicism that's part of culture in Latin America. And that Pentecostalism is a different kind of context that Bergoglio is certainly aware of. And from what I can read from the books that I've been reading about him, he's very close to certain Pentecostal leaders in Argentina when he was the cardinal there. So in a word, I think if this is the right... So in a word, this Pope, in his context from Latin America, is not hung up with Europe, which I think is a good thing. He's not hung up on the intellectual brinksmanship between religious faith and secular culture. Instead, if a clash of cultures, it really is an encounter with the poor. It's an encounter with the poor. So that's his first context. The second context, though, is he is a Jesuit, right? And as a Jesuit in religious life, he also weathered the renewal of religious life in the face of all the paradigmatic shifts that were going on in the church and the world after Vatican Council II. That, of course, affected Jesuits around the world, kind of bringing your context, going back to the roots of the Society of Jesus. And Bergoglio was named superior of our provincial of the province of Argentina at a very, very difficult time. Not only was it kind of coming up just after trying to implement the council's reforms and a reflection on religious life, but also the dirty war. So he kind of was there in the crucible of both a political terror, you might say, with the kidnapping and the torture of Argentinians, trying to negotiate that, trying to negotiate how Jesuits were both trying to create movements of peace, but also not completely ostracize themselves from the political conversation. So this provincial, this Bergoglio had to kind of maneuver between that. One of the things that has happened over the last couple months is that we're now reading the documents that he wrote while he was provincial. A Jesuit named Philip Endine has translated from the Spanish into English a lot of his exhortations, what he told the Jesuits in different conferences, things like that. And what comes up mostly from these things, at least in my estimation, is how important, as a Jesuit, the spiritual exercises are to the way he understands his style of management. That in some ways, he has a Jesuit way of proceeding that is still kind of part of his papacy. You might say that it's got three things, at least if you read these documents. One, The word discernment is such a big word in Jesuit education, Ignatian education. It's a discernment between different goods, things that are good to try to find a way through to the deepest good or the deepest truth, right? The second one is dialogical. His exhortations, these exhortations are in some ways old-fashioned, but they're always open-ended. There's a kind of a question of response coming back to you. And thirdly, I think that you see him in his writings wanting wide consultation, even though there might be narrow decision-making. And that idea of wide consultation being a real consultation, not just kind of, not just in words, but really listening to people. So those three things come up a lot in his time. We're having a Jesuit come on Thursday who's a friend of his, who's up at BC, an Argentinian Jesuit, and I played this out. Was this your experience of the man? And of course, he was a bit conservative with it, and he was a bit old-fashioned in some of his language about religious life. But he says, yes, these are true aspects of the man. So I think part of my year of being watching this Pope, and also being a Jesuit, is watching him kind of renew his love for the Society of Jesus and letting the world in, because he didn't have, it was a tough provincialate. It was a tough time, the Dirty War. He had Jesuits who were in prison because they were helping protests. They were helping to, some even got a little bit militant against the government. And so he really has a kind of a bad press at times from Argentinians, or at least one in particular Argentinian who's written a lot about it. And in some ways, because of that, after his provincialate, he kind of takes a back seat. He's kind of removed and extracted in some ways from governance in the Society of Jesus. He ultimately becomes an auxiliary bishop in Argentina, and then is raised to the Cardinal See of Buenos Aires. And so I think when he was first elected, I see some Jesuits in here, I think when we said Bergoglio, the Jesuits, the Pope, our jaws kind of dropped. We work for popes. We don't become them. That's the idea. And it's like, and who is this? And we all had to Google. Oh, he's the one. He's the one who was that provincial during the Dirty War. He was the one in the tough times. Kind of had receded from the front lines, perhaps, of Jesuit communities and perhaps Jesuit news, right? And so I think that this past year has not only been the Pope just letting the world into who he is, but specifically letting the Jesuits. And here you have Bergoglio, we'll call him Pope Francis now. Pope Francis embracing Father Adolfo Nicolas, the Father General of the Society of Jesus, which, the first couple of weeks probably was a little bit like, oh, how do I greet him? How do I meet him? I work for you, but I used to be under me, all that kind of stuff. So you can imagine that, right? And I think, of course, the Jesuit magazine, the interviews, the one that was done in the United States under America magazine was quite good too. Antonio Spadaro, who runs Civita Cattolica, went and actually interviewed him. And in many ways, I think this was as much an article or an essay or an interview for the world, but I also thought it was very much for the Society of Jesus, that we were learning about this brother Jesuit who has now become Pope. A couple of comments from that long interview. Again, discernment as appreciating the small things inside larger horizons is one of his quotes. And that wonderful moment where he asks for context and balance on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods. He writes, quote, "We have to find a new balance. Otherwise, even the moral edifice of the church is likely to fall like a house of cards, losing the freshness and fragrance of the gospel." So he's really trying to say that I'm not, and as Mark so beautifully said, he's not changing any kind of doctrinal things, or he's not even talking about doctrine per se, but his style has really changed. Looking for balance, discerning how to negotiate in the modern world. I also think that it was very important, at least for me, when he went to the Gesù, the mother church in Rome, and he went to Pedro Rupe's tomb. And Pedro Rupe got in a lot of trouble with John Paul II, because I don't think John Paul II understood Pedro Rupe and understood the Society of Jesus. He had worked so long in Poland where Jesuits were only parish priests. They didn't run schools. They didn't have any other kinds of ministries. And therefore, Jesuits were just another kind of parish priest. Well, if you know Jesuits here at the medical school, we're not just like any other parish. We do something different. And so I think there was a lot of kind of confusion, a lot of areas where John Paul II wasn't sure about the Society of Jesus. And Pedro Arrupe, in some ways, got the brunt of that. So by going, he's gone there twice to give flowers. And in terms of Jesuit community life, this was probably the most moving moments for us, because in some ways it kind of connects the past, the present, and the future of Jesuit governance and its role to be obedient and listen to the Holy Father as a way of missioning ourselves. So he's come twice to there, and I find that quite wonderful. He's also canonized Peter Faber. You might have heard he just said this guy, he was one of the friends of Ignatius. He was already a blessed. His works helped me. That's miracle enough. That's the second miracle, so let's canonize him. And so I do think we have to keep these things in mind, that he's a pope of the Southern Hemisphere who gets the church's need to be engaged with the world as a humble player in the field, so to speak. All right, so that's kind of part one. Part two, style is substance. The medium is the message with this man. There is a wonderful Jesuit historian named John O'Malley, and he has this kind of heuristic kind of look at why Vatican II was kind of a game changer in the way the church talked about itself and talked to the modern world. It went from this previous rhetoric of reproach, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, a syllabus of errors, you might even say, to a different kind of a rhetoric of affirmation and invitation. And I do think that this pope is the first pope who was never part of Vatican II. He just, again, it was the air we breathe. Benedict had some problems with Vatican II. Matter of fact, paragraph 5 and paragraph 11 of Gaudium et Spes, he's written about, those were bad paragraphs. We shouldn't have those, we should talk about those. So he's still fighting, in some ways, Benedict was still fighting aspects of Vatican II. John Paul II, at Vatican II, also loves Vatican II, but also was in some ways going to put his stamp on what is the real interpretation of Vatican II. I think that in some ways Bergoglio, or Pope Francis, never having been there, truly is kind of beyond that step. And therefore, Vatican II is no longer kind of this quagmire, at least for this Pope, of is this good and is this not so good? Was this well said or was this not well said? Benedict, to give him credit, was a German theologian and professor, and all of the German theologians, including Karl Rahner, other Jesuits, were unhappy at times with parts of Gaudium et Spes because it was written by the French, actually. And that was, I think it was more about French theologians versus German theologians getting to talk about the modern world. So at least that's what a friend of mine, Massimo Fagioli, tells me. All right, so the New Yorker, what are we talking about here? Here we have this artistic and urbane New York cover. It's hip, it's ironic, and of course the New Yorker loves it. And so in some ways he has gotten to the desk, the copy desk of the New Yorker magazine. He's also gotten to the copy desk of the Rolling Stone. I would say that the New Yorker essay, by the way, if you go back and look at it, is a very good essay. I think it's a really, really fine. I have some trouble with the Rolling Stone. I think it's trying to be a little bit I just don't think it's very fair at times. It's trying to make this kind of black and white dialectical change between Benedict and Francis, and I just don't think it's there. So I take a little bit of issue of that. But if we talk about style of substance, we do have him as a kind of rock star in a kind of media way, which is very different. Maybe at the beginning of John Paul II's reign, he was that way. You saw him all the time. But really, with Francis, it's all over the place. So what do we mean when we talk about the median is the message? Well, here we have the Pope in his own selfie, right? We have a sense that it will be how I am with people. It will be with the kinds of ways that I extemporaneously speak. And to hear him speak, there's a Pope app, on your phones. You can get the Pope app. It's a great app. I look at it every day. The Pope app will give you his 4-minute homily every single day the next day. If you want to know what this Pope is about, this is where you're looking. You're not looking at these long, big encyclicals. You're going to the 4-minute homily, where he's going to read Scripture, where he's going to talk about it, and do what I consider a very quick Jesuit daily mass type of liturgy. 5-minute homily, 4-minute homily. Wish that we always had that right in our Sunday churches. But there really is a sense of the medium is the message here. It's this connection with kids. It's the connection with people. It's turning in the limousine for a little Ford Focus. It's all that kind of stuff that you see daily that kind of becomes part of our news here. It's also, in terms of the medium is the message, it's all about the poor, right? There's a sense that the image speaks louder than words. And this Pope is all about using images to evangelize, to kind of reorientate how we think about things. He gets in trouble with some people because on Holy Thursday last year, just a month after being elected Pope, he goes and he washes the feet on Holy Thursday at a prison, and he also does a Muslim woman as well, which was just kind of unheard of. He, of course, had done this already in Buenos Aires. He brings this style of leadership to the fore here. As Pope, by the way, there's what we call a papal almoner, someone who gives out money to the poor or gives out charity to the poor. And usually that guy, from what I understood, is usually about 80 years old. It's kind of an honorific, and he sits at a desk and gives money out. This Pope, Pope Francis, said, put a 50-year-old Polish Monsignor in charge and said, here's the money. You're young. You're 50 years old. I want to see you out on the streets actually going out to the poor and saying this is money from the Vatican. So it's a very different kind of style, going out to the people. The medium is the message, picking somebody who can do this for him. The almoner is called Father Krzyzewski. It's all about joy and meeting people where they are. I happened to be in Rome last year. I teach every summer in Rome. And I got to go to the Harley Davidson blessing at St. Peter's in the piazza. And it was amazing to see all of these bikers with their jackets, their leather jackets, and all these hogs all the way down the Conciliazione, all the way down. I mean, it was just absolutely tremendous to see this. And the Pope goes by and he's blessing bikes and he's blessing people. He gets 2 motorcycles and he gets a leather jacket. Both of the bikes have been given auction for charity already. He's kept the leather jacket, I've been told. But there really is a sense, what is it about somebody? Harley Davidson was celebrating their anniversary in Europe, in Rome. And so they were parading through the streets of Rome. What is it that they wanted to have this kind of connection? They felt drawn to him. Again, going to meet people where they are, probably at the margins of what we consider the church today. Certainly hugging, kissing, caressing children, babies, the disfigured, the handicapped. Every time he does it, it seems to make the news. It's just absolutely amazing to me. A good friend of mine who now works at Loyola used to work in Rome, and their first child had Down syndrome, and they sent me 50 pictures because they thought, well, we've got our little Annie here. The Pope sees Annie, goes over and has a conversation with them, and holds up Annie, and of course, hundreds of pictures. And so this was the Christmas card for my friend Michael Beasley. But there really is a sense then that these images speak to not only about what he thinks is important, but the smile that he has on his face. His sister, by the way, who's in Argentina, when he was made Pope about 3 months into it, she, in an article in a newspaper in Argentina, says, I don't know what I've never seen him smile so much in my life. He was kind of a grumpy guy. Growing up, he was grumpy, and he was grumpy as the cardinal. She's saying this about her brother, right? Because he's smiling, something. And so she says, of course she says, it's the work of the Holy Spirit. It's the work of the Holy Spirit. So there is a sense that something turned on. Something did switch on at this election of this Pope. And here you see him. This kid kind of comes up while he's giving a talk and keeps on trying to talk to him. And so the Pope's trying to keep him quiet on the stage.